Once again, thanks very much for joining me. I'm going to obviously tease out as much as I can from you in terms of your knowledge and understanding. But
yeah, go for it. You ask what you want.
Yeah, but before I do, I just want to put things into context because I'd like to get a flavor for the industry as a whole, and then maybe we can drill down into some strategies and so forth. And so let me just share my screen with you for a moment, because I've got some stats here which you might be able to shed some light on. So in terms of the entire industry, I mean, the stats show an estimate of nearly 24 billion pounds worth of revenue throughout. I mean, that's a growth, a relative growth. When you especially when you think that in between that we've had the pandemic, where obviously there's a dip.
Yeah, but I noticed your stats are quite
yeah. I mean, I'm also quite interested to see that the independents are quite a significant chunk of that. I've always assumed them to be the independents and the tenanted to be a larger sector, but they're probably about half and half, really, when you take them together.
Yeah, if you include the tenants, you tend to find that they make up quite a bigger chunk. It's decreased over many years because obviously we had the situation where the pub ownerships and the breweries had to limit how many pubs they could own.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's how the likes of the Wetherspoons of this world came into being.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, that's interesting. You should say that, because I was also looking at the leading pubs, basically in terms of number of pubs, and Stonegate is way out there up front, and Wetherspoons is only 871 according to these stats. I would expect Wetherspoons to be a lot more present in the market.
I'm not 100% certain, but I believe Stonegate is a situation where a lot of the pubs some are owned, some are managed, and some are tenanted. So it's a case of they have the kind of like largest ownership.
Yes.
But the way they've set it up is that they own the brand.
Right.
They don't necessarily own. They don't necessarily run the build. All of the pubs are Stonegate, if you know what I mean.
Oh, I see what you mean. So they're kind of undercover in terms of an organization. That would probably explain some of the other stats I've seen in terms of their revenue, which I couldn't quite understand when you consider their presence in terms of pubs. Because when you look at the competition, you've got Queens up there. Green Kings up there, Marsden, Mitchell and Butlers. I never even heard of Mitchell and Butlers. And they're probably
based in the Midlands somewhere, and they're quite large, very large, I think. Yeah.
Youngs we know about, but yes. But then when you look at the actual statistics against them, then it kind of surprises me that maybe these stats are totally off the wall, really, because Stonegate, for instance, they're saying revenue of 5 million, which I really don't believe. That's probably more like 5 billion, I'd have thought.
I don't necessarily think it will be, because there's Stonegate, the pub company, then there's Stonegate, which is, I think they're separate companies. I'm not 100% certain.
Well, this one is represented by the pub company, Stonegate pub company. Yeah.
But I think they probably aren't allowed to show the businesses of other things. But to be honest, the figures don't look right.
They don't, do they? Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
You can't have 4,000 pubs and have less employees. Well, you can, because you don't necessarily run the pubs. You actually.
No, you don't employ. Yeah, you don't employ. I mean, it could be a head office operation.
Yes.
One could imagine, but the revenue's got to come. It's got to come in somewhere, because then you've got Green Kings, which I feel those figures are far more realistic. 2.4 billion.
Yeah, Green King have grown, and they also own a lot more than just pubs. They own hotels and all sorts of things.
Right. Okay. Marston again up there, 1.1 billion.
Again, another brewery that basically has merged with other breweries to become a bigger brewery.
Yeah. And then the one that really jumps out at you is Molson Coors.
Molson Coors, I believe, is Canadian. It may be American.
Yeah.
But that's probably not a helpful figure because I don't imagine that just is the UK.
So that's probably a global picture. I was going to say, because if you were to consider that, they are taking half of the market, pretty much.
Yeah,
half of
both Molson are brewers. It's a beer.
Yeah.
Coors is another beer.
Yeah.
But I believe it's a Canadian-based company. Certainly, Molson used to be a Canadian-based company.
Yeah.
So that will just be a UK branch, but it may be the fact that they obviously sell beers to all of the other pubs. So that's not a pub revenue. That's a brewery revenue, which is very different. Yeah.
Okay. So let's look also at the trend in terms of number of pubs in the UK. And the consensus certainly is that it's shrinking. If you look from year 2000, you got some 60,000 pubs, now 47,000 pubs 2019, and that doesn't actually factor in what could have happened over the pandemic.
I would imagine that might have reduced by as much as 10,000, to be honest.
Yeah. So it, obviously it's swings and roundabouts in terms of the impact, because on the one hand, obviously it's a loss to the economy, a loss to the community, but is it on the other end an opportunity for the surviving pubs, and they should be getting bigger and better business? Would that be the case?
I would say yes, provided the business model works. I don't know how far back you could go, but I would imagine we had well in excess of 100,000 pubs, probably 20 years prior to that.
Yeah.
In the 1980s.
Yeah.
So it's been a long-term trend of downward.
Yeah.
But that's true of most businesses. I mean, if I live in Peterborough, and I can think of at least 8 pubs that have gone completely, no longer exist.
Yeah. And what do you think replaces them, or do you think people just get the tins home and have a session at home? Is that?
There is an element of people drinking at home more. Obviously, the pubs have a real issue there because the VAT rates are different, although temporarily that's changed.
Right.
Also, another factor is the fact that the high streets are just not as busy as they used to be, and a lot of pubs are in the high street.
Yeah.
On top of that, you've also got the situation where the bigger companies are able to compete at a much higher level. I mean, for example, Wetherspoons, when they first started, they were converting old banks and old shops and things like that. If you go virtually anywhere in a Wetherspoons, that previously had some very interesting history.
One of my favorite pubs in the Aldrich, when I used to be at London School of Economics, was definitely an old bank. I mean, it's really quite sort of prolific in its size and expanse. When you go in there, you feel like you're going back, into the 19th century.
I know that pub well. Yeah, I've been in that pub before. I think it was an NatWest.
And the other aspect to that I found was, I mean, again, it might be footfall, might be brand, I don't know, but it was always packed in there. It was always packed, and there's always people eating. It was crazy. It was always crazy in there. Loved it.
I think food plays a very important part in pub culture nowadays. If you realistically, wet sales have dropped a lot, I would say. But food is supplemented. Probably one of the reasons for Wetherspoons' success is the fact that they have gone with the food model, and particularly they offer better value than the vast majority. But then they've not had to put their wet sales such high levels, so they've created a kind of almost a cult following.
Yeah. I mean, the figures do stack up in terms of what you're saying in terms of the emergence of Wetherspoons over the decade. They've had a significant growth. Obviously, COVID has played a significant part in 2020, as you can see. But this idea of food, as you were saying, is quite an interesting one also, because the trend of people employed in the food service within bars is definitely growing, and it's taken over the bar, according to this particular
graph. Yeah, I
graph.
think that's absolutely 100% accurate.
Yeah. And then again, in terms of the actual product segment, we see 25% of sales being contributed to food now. Beer still the top runner, but only 32% when you think of the traditional pub. The traditional pub, where you might just be able to get a sandwich along with your Guinness, but that's about it. But now it's all changed, and for me, I would have thought it would be a welcome change. I mean, the stats suggest that there's now a trend of eating out a lot more, probably a lot more profligate in certain cities and so forth. But the other aspect is the community, because let's face it, pubs have always been the center, especially if you watch EastEnders. It's always been the center of the universe for most communities. So what's happening? What's happening to communities when the pubs disappear?
I think the pubs that are disappearing most are the pubs in small villages and things like that. We've kind of seen a consolidation in the centres of cities and towns.
Yeah.
So although there are maybe less pubs, there are perhaps bigger pubs in the locations. But I think the thing is that the small villages are really finding it really hard. I mean, to be honest, they struggle to make profits unless they do something to attract people from out of the village often, because people don't go drinking as often as they used to, and that easy and fast profit.
Yeah.
The downside to food sales, of course, is it's much more labour intensive. It's a lot quicker to be able to serve a pint of beer than it is to make a burger, for example.
Yeah.
And of course, there's much more competition for food, because food is competed by restaurants, by cafes, by
yes.
Whereas beer sales, I mean, apart from sales through supermarkets, there aren't really that many other alternative ways of selling beer, cider, wine. Obviously some in hotels, but nothing like that. So
there's also an emerging trend that suggests that the younger sort of between 16 to 24-year-olds, I don't know if you would call them millennials, they might be post-millennials, they're not drinking as much. They're becoming alcohol free, which is an interesting trend. Yeah.
Historically, the cost of alcohol-free drinks has always been exceedingly high, and the profit margins are very high.
Yeah.
So, for example, they may charge the same for a glass of Coke as they would a pint of beer.
Yeah.
But the profit on the glass of Coke is about 3 to maybe 5 times as much, if not more, sometimes.
Yeah.
And obviously things like coffee and that go hand in hand with food. But it is quite difficult for the pubs to kind of appear to be offering a good deal when you consider you can go and buy a bottle of Coke, a large 2-litre bottle of Coke for a couple of quid.
Yeah.
And yet then they're charging you that for a pint of it, kind of thing. It's a difficult one for them to call, because ultimately the profit margins are good.
Yeah.
And as you say, the demand is going up.
Yeah. I mean, what interests me is a little bit of your background, your history in the sector, Graham. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was a few years ago, but I've kept an interest, because obviously once you're in the industry, you kind of do. Yeah. It's been sad to see how it's all gone kind of pear-shaped during the COVID thing.
Yeah.
I initially worked for a very large brewery called Grand Metropolitan.
Yeah.
And I worked with them for about 10 years, I suppose, off and on. The situation was that they had thousands of pubs, and they were forced into a situation where they had to get rid of a large number of pubs.
Yeah.
And as I say, the two that I worked in Peterborough, which is where I'm living now, both have now, one is a restaurant and the other one has become a car park.
Look at that.
And it's quite sad, really, because you drive past or walk past pubs in towns and villages, and you see that they're all boarded up, and you think, well, that used to be a really busy, thriving pub.
Yeah.
My view is that I left the industry a while ago, but as I say, I've kept that interest. My view is that those that are carrying on running pubs, there are those that are doing really, really well.
Yeah.
There are those that could do so much better with very little additional changes, but just what they're doing.
Yeah.
I think the most pressed are generally those that are not in city centres. But I think ultimately even the city centre pubs, those that haven't got the financial clout, need to start to look at their business model, because there are fewer and fewer people coming into city centres.
Yes.
Obviously COVID, we had virtually nobody coming into city centres. I was in the city yesterday and I noticed a handful of people walking through town. Admittedly, pubs would have been shut at that time, but I was quite shocked. I imagined it would be so much busier, and it's not.
Yeah.